This one we're going to cover page 2 of the real estate purchase contract and probably page 3 as well. So again, in section 3 is covering what settlement is. It details out that what has to take place for settlement is the buyer and seller have to sign the documents. Any monies required by the buyer or seller have to be taken to the title company, and then also have signed all the documents, everything. Prorations, it just explains how the prorations, so if it's a part of an HOA, how taxes and those things will be handled if there's rents. Special assessments is going to break down if there are any capital improvements as approved by the HOA or by a municipality. Sometimes people think, well, I don't need to check any of these boxes because it's not part of an HOA. Well, it's possible there's a special improvement district or something that the city or someone charges. So as a general rule, again, I usually would check this box for the seller here, is what I would check. The only time really you may want to look at buyer or split equally between them is if it was a competitive offer and you were trying to do something to make it work a little better, or you knew there were some assessments and the buyer was willing to pay parts of them for some reason. One that I had that we did something like that was they had gone through the HOA, or excuse me, the city had gone through and put in the fiber in Orem, and so the seller was still in the process of paying for that each month, and they wanted the buyer to take over the payments of it based on the price we did. That's how we ended up breaking this down. So, but again, as a general rule, you're going to check the seller box here for special assessments. Fees and costs, this is breaking down just that they're each going to pay half of the fee charged by the title companies. And then the closing is when closing takes place, which is important because when we get into section 4 here, is once settlement has been completed. So once the documents have been signed, the money's been there and everything, and then all the proceeds have been delivered by the lender or the seller or the buyer to the title company, and the documents have been recorded at the county recorders. That's when closing takes place. So that leads us now down to possession. So possession then, on this, really it kind of just depends. If the property's vacant, I really would recommend just do upon closing and check this box right here for upon closing. If for some reason you knew the seller was out by the time, you maybe would want to do so many hours after closing. So again, these hours would start, so let's say that it closed, which again, closing is all the documents recorded, settlements done, proceeds are all there. Once that take place, then is when this number of hours would kick in. So if it had closed at 2 o'clock, then your hours would start to count. 3 o'clock would be hour 1, 4 o'clock would be hour 2, so on. Days after closing, again, would just be so many days afterwards. So typically on possession, you're going to just kind of somewhat work through that. It's not uncommon for somebody to do 24 or 48 hours here or 1 to 2 days here. Some agents I've seen do 72 hours. I've even seen some do 7 days. So typically, you're going to probably do it a shorter time frame than a longer time frame. But again, if the property is vacant, you probably would do upon closing. If it is occupied, you still could do upon closing, but usually people will do somewhere 24 or 48 hours after closing is what will take place. Next then is going to be the confirmation of agency. So in the confirmation of agency, the seller's agent is going to be the listing agent. You'll put their name in here and check seller. Seller's brokerage, put the name of the seller's brokerage, check represents seller. Buyer's agent is going to be your name, represents the buyer, and then Century 21 Everest represents the buyer. Now the thing to keep in mind though is if the seller's brokerage up here is going to be Century 21 Everest Realty Group also, then you'll need to check both buyer and seller as limited agent. It doesn't matter if it's 2 different agents within Century 21 or 1 agent in Century 21. So meaning you were writing the offer on your own listing. If you write an offer on another Century 21 Everest listing, you're going to put Century 21 Everest here, check the represents both buyer and seller. Century 21 Everest here represents both buyer and seller. If there were 2 different agents, then the listing agent still would represent the seller, you still represent the buyer. If your name is on seller's agent and buyer's agent, then you'll do the both boxes over here. Title insurance, this one's just breaking down the saying that the seller has fee title to the property, meaning they can sell the property. There's not going to be anything holding it back from happening. Title insurance is just saying the seller will pay for an owner's policy of title insurance for the buyer, which is just going to ensure the property that they have all the rights and everything to the property. Seller disclosure deadline. This one is just saying no later than the seller disclosure deadline, the seller will provide to the buyer seller's disclosures. Now, what that breaks it down to say is a written copy of the seller disclosure. So those are the normal ones that we would have a seller fill out. Oh, before we move on, the buyer is going to initial each of these pages. Then down here, you've got the seller also needs to give a commitment for title insurance, a copy of any restrictive covenants or the CC&Rs to the buyer, a copy of the most recent minutes, budget, and financial statements if it's part of a homeowners association, copy of any leases, evidence of water shares or water rights, and written notice to any claims or conditions relating to environmental problems with the property. And then there's a spot for other here. So let's say typically you're not going to put much on other. However, there are times where maybe somebody wants more than the most recent minutes. Maybe you want 3 months worth of the minutes from the HOA. You would put that on here. But all of these items have to be delivered to the buyer by the seller disclosure deadline in Section 24. All right, next is Section 8, Buyer's Due Diligence. So pretty much you're almost always going to be checking this is box, that the obligation is contingent upon the buyer's purchase the buyer's due diligence of the property, meaning that they get to do any inspections that they want to do. So almost always you're going to do is. The only time really I would do an is not is pretty much if the client knows they're going to be tearing the place down to rebuild it, then you may not want to. You may do an is not. But the difference is just gives them the right to do inspections. Is not, they could still do inspections, but they couldn't cancel based on those inspections. Hopefully that makes sense. 8.1a explains due diligence, says that the buyer gets to review and approve the contents of the seller disclosures, do whatever tests, evaluations, and verifications of the property, and then lists all the different things that they could do. Once they have done that, then they have the right to cancel the contract or object. So the buyer can, in their own sole discretion, just cancel the contract, or they could go back and ask the seller, hey, here's what we found, we would like you to fix it. But you have to do all that and have it all determined by the seller disclosure, or the due diligence deadline referenced in 24B. So by that deadline that you put on 24B, they need to have all their objections resolved, or they just need to cancel the contract. And then C here says if they fail to do that, so if you fail to cancel the contract or get things resolved in writing, any objections that the buyer has, then it's deemed that the buyer has waived the due diligence condition. So not doing anything basically just waives your deadline. It doesn't cancel, it doesn't do anything like that, it waives your deadline. So by that due diligence deadline, the buyer either needs to be satisfied with the property as it is, or have had the seller agree to making some changes. 8.2 appraisal condition. Again, on this, you're pretty much always going to do is. The times you maybe would not do an is would be if it was a cash purchase and the seller was comfortable with the price, the buyer was comfortable with what that price was. But again, that just because they're paying cash doesn't mean they can't do an appraisal. They could do an appraisal if they want to. So most of the time, again, I would, even if they're not planning to, I usually say to the buyer, if we check the is box, you don't have to do it, but if for some reason you changed your mind a week down the road or whatever, you still could. So I usually recommend doing an is here, but again, there are maybe circumstances which you would do is not. Again, to 8.2a, the buyer's right to cancel. This is again just saying if the completion of an appraisal is done and it does not appraise, so what they call that is a notice of appraised value. So if they get that from the lender saying that the property didn't appraise and the buyer wants to cancel, they can cancel and get the earnest money back. And again, failure to cancel is just deemed that they've waived that appraisal condition. So if they do cancel, they get the earnest money back, as it says here. But typically what will happen if it does not appraise is you would talk with the listing agent and try to work it out to get the seller to either come down, the buyer could bring in additional funds, or you just cancel the contract. So those are the things to talk about and try to work through there. 8.3 financing condition. Again, if they're getting a loan at all, do the is. If they're cash buyer, you could do is not. But even if they were borrowing cash from their parents or their parents were paying cash for them, to me, unless it's their money and it is available in their account, they can spend it anytime they want, I would check the is box. If they've got the cash there available, you could do is not. But again, I've seen situations where the parents were going to just give them the money, and so it was there and available, but for some reason down the road the parents decided, no, I don't think you're getting a good enough deal, we're not going to give the money. So again, I still would say to do the is, even if the parents are going to be the ones quote unquote financing the property for them, then I would do is. So hopefully that makes sense. The buyer's right to cancel before financing and appraisal deadline. Again, if prior to that deadline, in the buyer's sole discretion, they don't like the terms of the loan, they can cancel and they get the earnest money back. And it could be for, just the rate went up a little bit, whatever. If they don't like the terms, they can cancel. The buyer's right to cancel after the appraisal deadline. If we've passed that deadline and they decide to cancel, they don't get the earnest money back. The seller will get the earnest money, is what this is saying. So again, have your buyer's initial, you date it here, and that's all we're going to talk about in this video.